Welcome to the joint Troy City Council and Planning Commission special meeting for April the 18th, 2016. We have the roll call, Ms. Stewart.
Mayor Dean Slater,
Here.
Councilmember Abraham,
Here.
Councilmember Baker,
Here.
Councilmember Campbell,
Here.
Councilmember Henderson,
Here.
Councilmember Holbrook,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Pennington,
Here.
Chairman Don Edson,
Here.
Mr. Abahadian,
Here.
Ms. Cruz,
Here.
Mr. Farzan,
Here.
Mr. Hudson,
Here.
Mr. Krantz,
Here.
Ms. Peppa,
Here.
Mr. Sanzika, Mr. Tagle.
Here. Well, what a great turnout this evening. It's always nice to be back with the Planning Commission for these joint meetings. We have one discussion item this evening, and well, I think we only have 1 hour tonight, so I think we have a full plate. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to City Manager Brian Kishnick for his introduction to tonight's meeting. Good evening, Brian.
Thanks, Mayor, and both councils. Tonight, we're gonna get through this in an hour with everyone here. What we have tonight is the cluster development discussion. The good news is, a long time ago, 6 to 9 months, we scheduled this joint meeting, knowing full well that there would be woodland protection leading into cluster development. And it just, by design, happened that this meeting tonight would be a combined meeting to talk about the cluster development. So the Planning Commission has talked about it, and Brett and his staff have filled us in on that, and they put together a nice presentation to get the conversation going as a joint body so that the Planning Commission can continue to do their work with and present it to the City Council. So I'll stop right there. Brett Sabadan's going to do the presentation, and at the end you'll see some discussion points. Try to keep it to a minimum. I think there's 4 discussion points for you to think about as you conclude the presentation.
Thanks, Brian. So obviously the topic of tonight's discussion is cluster development, and I'm going to assume that there's some people either in the room or watching on television that don't know what cluster development is. So there's a definition. Cluster development is a zoning tool that involves grouping homes within a development so that the remaining land on the site can be preserved for recreation, open space, and protection of natural features. A couple of illustrations to show what we're talking about. On the left is a conventional, traditional type of a layout for a subdivision or a site condominium. It also happens to look a lot like what we've been seeing a lot of lately, which is a very uncreative, unimaginative type design, where the developer comes in, busts a road down the middle of the development, and fits as many lots as possible based on the underlying zoning. When you also add the fact that until 2 months ago we didn't have tree protection, oftentimes it involved clear cutting or certainly negatively impacting natural features. The one thing positive that this does from a cluster development type of perspective is this is a parallel plan. This is the maximum number of units that one could do on this site. In this case, it happens to be 14 units. So that's the magic number of how many lots moving forward if someone wanted to pursue clustering. So on the right is what could happen with the same land. You have the same number of units, 14 units, but they've managed to preserve some open space by pushing the units closer to each other or clustering. So the word comes from obviously those units. Notice the length of road here. In the traditional it's 450 feet. In clustering it's significantly less, 150 feet less. So there's a cost savings. Less road, less underground utilities, less sidewalks. It's one of the advantages of reducing infrastructure. Other advantages include obviously preserving natural features, permitting creativity, and preserving the character of the area and the area around it. So that was kind of the general, everything you ever wanted to know about cluster development in 2 minutes. Now look at the city of Troy. We have an existing cluster ordinance. It just isn't very good. I've been here going on 14 years, and over that time, we've had one. And it was a couple years ago, Cedar Pines Woods. This is located, this is Crooks, South Boulevard's up here. It's 8 units, and this is the only developer who's taken advantage of the option. And the reason for that is There's no economic incentive or economic benefit. It's too expensive to do this types of things, and I'll get into that, why that is. So, Brian mentioned the woodland protection ordinance. We talked about, when we adopted the woodland protection ordinance, we talked about the importance of also updating this cluster option to kind of coincide and complement woodland protection. And to do what the Planning Commission came up with 3 goals for updating this. They wanted to remove barriers to cluster development, wanted to incentivize cluster development, and they wanted to prevent design flexibility and creativity. So with this, as our 3 goals, we prepared a first draft, and we talked about that first draft at the last meeting. It's very rudimentary, not ready for prime time. There's some issues. That's one of the benefits of having the timing of this meeting. It's worked out perfectly because it gets both bodies in at the ground floor at the beginning of this process, so there's no surprises for anybody. So this is a great opportunity for a meeting here and to share ideas. So the first goal, removing barriers to cluster development. Our existing ordinance requires a minimum of 30% open space. It's relatively difficult to achieve, so we want to immediately start at the starting point 20%. To get a density bonus under our existing ordinance, you have to preserve 50% open space. Half your site has to be preserved as open space. It's very difficult, again, to achieve. You also have to do one of these 3 things. You have to propose a sustainable design project. I won't get into the details. Preserve 150 feet perimeter around the project has to be open space, or you have to donate significant land to the city. Again, challenging and not exactly incentivizing this type of development. The second is we wanted to encourage design flexibility, provide an opportunity to be creative for the developer. So we're going to propose it to maintain existing setbacks, but allowing the Planning Commission the authority to waive internal setbacks, those that relate to each other, the buildings on site that relate to each other, not the neighbors, provided that the applicant has demonstrated innovation and creative site and building designs and solutions and met specific standards. Well, we haven't come up with the standards yet, but that's the intent. The third is to incentivize, and this is important, and I'll provide some illustrations here as example. But as a starting point, if a developer qualifies by providing the 20% open space, they get a 20% density bonus. So right out of the gate, they get 20% more units. The draft that we've talked about, and we'll talk about this point in a few minutes, is right now we're talking about allowing up to a 50% density bonus. So you can get 50% more units if you do a combination of increased open space, providing housing diversity, some units that we're not seeing a lot of in the marketplace today, and also making it of the sustainable design. If you do all these 3 things, or a combination of these 3 things, you get a 50% bonus. Another thing we've talked about is allowing 2-family dwellings, attached units, as a special use in R1C, R1D, and R1E. If you really are serious and you really want to be bold and encourage preservation of open space, attaching units eliminates a lot of like small yards, and it makes it easier to get large common open space. It's something that the Planning Commission is considering. So here's some examples. On the left, this is the base property. We've got some wooded areas, wetlands, and the first step is identifying what the maximum build-out is. So the middle illustration, these are meant to look kind of cartoonish and conceptual to make our point. If laid out bare bones, 60 units on 10,500 acre minimum size. That's the parallel plan. That's the magic number, 60 units. If the developer then decides to cluster and preserves 20% open space, they get a 10% bonus, 20% bonus, 12 additional units, so 60 plus 12 is 72 units. And here's our 20% open space. Makes a pretty significant impact, that 20%. Much more inviting, and you start to not impact this wetland area here. Let's look at it a little bit more intense here. 30% open space. Now, besides making this area even larger, we've managed to impact the woodland area a little bit less. We've also introduced attached units here. These darker yellow ones are attached, 2 units attached. 40%. Now we're really making a splash with how much open space has been preserved. We've also introduced a lot more attached product. The trade-off being preserving more open space, more natural features. And finally, to the right, 50% open space and a 50% density bonus. But because the units have been attached, the footprints are less. The overall coverage by buildings is less, but there's, you could almost say, dramatic impact on the character of this site. So to summarize, Planning Commission had these 3 goals: remove barriers, incentivize, and permit design flexibility and creativity. So now we get to the 4 talking points that Brian alluded to in his introduction. 4 questions. Go over each one. The draft that we prepared and we talked about proposes that the approval authority is by Planning Commission and not City Council. Until 2011, all site condominiums and subdivisions were approved, was provided by Planning Commission. They were approved by City Council. In 2011, for site condominiums, which is what most single-family detached developments are today, are site condominiums, the Planning Commission is the review and approval authority. It's been like that for 5 years. The difference here is, with density bonuses, it adds in a whole other layer and a whole other element. So the question that we'll talk about tonight, one of them is, should Planning Commission continue to have this authority, given that it may involve more density above what's permitted by right? So that's question 1. Question 2, I talked about housing diversity, and we all know, we've all heard the conversation, people that have lived in Troy for a long time, raised their family here, worked here, whatever, and they've been in a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot home, and now the kids are leaving, the house is too big, they want to downsize. And what I'm hearing, at least at the counter, and people calling me and dropping by and emailing me, when are we going to get more housing diversity? When are we going to get smaller homes, empty nester type homes, first floor master suite, first floor laundry? When's this going to happen? The development community is not building them. So one of the things that the Planning Commission wanted to do was incentivize that. We talked about what's the maximum, if we give a 10% bonus for providing a certain number of these units, what's the maximum square footage that these units should be? And the first draft that we talked about with the Planning Commission was at 1,500 units. And I think there was Tom, I think it was you and one other planning commissioner thought that 1,500 was the right size. But most other planning commissioners thought it was too low. And we went as high as about 2,000 square feet. I talked to Brian before the Planning Commission meeting, and we both thought that 1,500 was actually too big. Brian was comfortable with 1,200, and that's kind of what I was thinking. 1,500, I thought the Planning Commission would be all over this. But the question is this the right number? And if not, what is the right number? That's question 2. Question 3, the density bonus. The draft that we've got now is a 50% cap. You can get up to 50% density bonus. Well, Planning Commissioner Apahidian put together some drawings, and he went up to 80% open space, and they look really good. Really good. I didn't share them because I wanted to keep this, I've already talked too long. I wanted to keep this simple. But is a hard cap realistic? Or do we really want to incentivize and encourage this and allow unlimited or maybe up to 80 or 90 or 100? What's the right answer? That's what we're going to talk about. Finally, the attached. Again, as another bonus. And to help incentivize, allow attached by special use. Our first draft talked about having it in R1C, D, and E. I thought it was a good idea when we first conceived this idea. It made a lot of sense, but when you map it, R1A starts in the northwest corner. It goes B, C, D, and E. In terms of lot size, A is about 2 units per acre, 3, 4, 5, 6 units per acre. It made sense to allow attached housing on the more dense districts because it was already at a certain density. But when you look at how much land area is available here, and you think about how large some of these large lots would lend themselves to being redeveloped, do we want to consider, again, as a special use and only to reach certain density bonuses, do we want to consider the attached houses in R1A and R1B? So those are the 4 questions, and I'll leave them up on the screen. Thank you very much.
This is a suggestion. I think it would be good to go 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we'll have a discussion on 1, and then we'll move down to 2, 3, and 4. So let's start with number 1, approval authority by the planning commissioner of the city council. And I have my thoughts, but I thought we could open that discussion up. Who wants to go first? Ms. Cruz.
I have the benefit of already having had several conversations about the cluster zoning ordinance as planning commissioner. After giving it thought, the final approval authority, I think, should come from city council. We talked about having public hearings associated with the cluster zoning ordinance because, you know, it's a big change. And for a lot of residents in Troy, should something like that come in their neighborhood, I think they want the opportunity to be heard. So I think that I would vote for letting Planning Commission have the discretion to work with some of these other things that Brent has talked about, but when it comes to final approval authority, I think that that should stay with City Council for the density bonuses and the public hearing.
I concur wholeheartedly with that, because I think, you know, we're about public input and public comment. And this gives the public 2 bites at the apple. You know, so I think the more time you can get public input, I know it does lengthen the process, and time is money for developers, but I think it's the way to go.
I agree also. I think I can speak for at least some of the city council that we'll get calls, we'll get emails, and there's nothing that we can do, you know, so I think it is probably a needed step in this particular process to include the council. Any other comments from council? It seemed like kind of a no-brainer to me. So number 2, the maximum square footage of alternative housing types to achieve the density. Now you have to understand, this is to achieve the bonus. This isn't saying that it has to be 1,500 square feet, but to be part of the bonus, do we want to set a maximum at 1,500 square feet? So, who has some thoughts on that? Alpana?
I was one of the 3 planning commissioners who felt 1,500 was sufficient. John Tagle, Trent, and I all were satisfied with 15. I would continue to say 15 is good. I think that we have a lot of stuff. I think that's what Tom said at our meeting, and I think that as we accumulate stuff, if we keep the house small, then we will be not as tempted to accumulate. And if it's meant for people who are first starting out as well as people who are downsizing, I think it's a happy medium for both.
Good.
I would have to agree. 1,500 seems to be the right maximum size. I mean, there's certainly, if you're coming from the Oak River and want to downsize into something smaller, you know, you're all naturally going to be getting rid of many of your things because your kids have moved out of the house. 1,500 is, even for a starter house, is still relatively big. When you look at the houses, the older houses in Royal, Berkeley, Clawson, I mean, those are sometimes quite a bit smaller. So this seems realistic and feasible.
I must agree. I was just thinking back, when we first got married, we bought a house in Royal Oak. It was 900 square feet. And we were just doing fine. We had 1 child and the second one the other way, so we needed more space when we moved, but 900 square feet seemed to work just well. And I'm thinking if you're retired, as you're getting rid of your stuff, that 1,500 would seem to be more than adequate, in my opinion.
Ali, did you?
Yeah, I think 1,500 might seem like the sweet spot, but the way it's written right now is there is only a 10% incentive, 10% bonus, and maybe something to look at is to actually incentivize that even more, meaning increase that to 15 if we actually really want to push that product and keep it limited to that square footage. to give it such an incentive that actually that product comes up more frequently being the preferred product by developers, and not just give it an equal 10% bonus as other bonuses. Maybe that might be something to consider.
Maybe not 5%.
I tend to agree with that. I think, you know, you have to, what is your goal here? You know, if your goal is to try and encourage development for empty nesters or for starter homes, that seems like that ought to be a higher percentage to me. Tom, did you?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Through the recent decade, I've had so many people come up to me and say, how come Troy doesn't have a smaller home for us? We have to find a home or development outside of Troy. And a lot of them told me they've actually gone to Sterling Heights for this. I'm thinking, we've got to create a reason for developers to create smaller homes. Smaller homes don't mean ugly homes. Smaller homes, you could have a $500,000, 1,500 square foot home and be absolutely stunning. And that's what the kind of quality I want Troy to have, and to give them an incentive to do that, I think sends a good message of what I feel the next decade or 2 decades from now are going to be the demand for housing. It's both, not just the senior citizens, but also the young people. They would like a smaller home because truthfully, they are not the people that enjoy mowing lawns, et cetera. They are more focused on their work, either work at home or work at an office, and they're more mobile. I'm just thinking we've got to have a market for those two ends of the barbells. The younger group that wants smaller spaces and the older group that wants smaller spaces. And that's why I'd say 1,500 square feet is certainly adequate, but it will add an incentive. We got to incentivize the developers to go to that spot.
And one of the other things, it does not prohibit larger homes, but they would not get the density. So some of those developers might still elect to do it.
On the duplex, I guess we call them, are those each going to be 1,500? Or that's going to be a 3,000 square foot house, or maybe 750 apiece, or?
No, each 1,500.
1,500. So that's going to be a 3,000 square foot building.
Yes.
On those lots.
Two units.
I agree. I think 1,500 is more than enough. I think 1,200 for a retired person and somebody with one child. That's plenty of house. And there is no place in Troy to go to get those. So I agree with Tom. That's something we need for our people that are out here. And people want to come there. So I like it.
Brent, could I just add, this is going to go back to the planning commission, and it's your intent to bring in some developers and have presentations and discussions. One of the questions I had, you know, is a developer, we can do this, but isn't a developer really going to come in and do what we want? It would be nice to hear from developers what would really incentivize you to come do this project. This may or may not be something that would do that, I'm not sure.
That's a great point. Our next step, once we get a solid draft, and we're not quite there yet, but once with this input that we're receiving tonight, we'll firm that up and have it, bring it back to the planning commission. When we're happy with it, we'll test it with the development community, get a reality check. That's very important.
Any other discussion on number 2?
I just have to convince my wife to put the grand piano in the attic.
Or the basement.
Good luck with that.
Because she's not going to get rid of it, I can tell. She'll get rid of it before she does it.
But you in the attic, huh?
I'm in the attic.
Number 3, density bonus. I think we saw some examples of a 50% hard cap. Unfortunately, we didn't see Ollie's cluster at 80%, but
That's good.
having heard that, that certainly is possible. So, who wants to open the discussion on this 50%? Ollie, would you?
what I did was I just did some exercises for myself, and I did some hypothetical projects that would most likely happen in Troy. Instead of a 60, 70, 80 unit development, I went down to maybe 10, 15, 20, and try to see what kind of maximum density I can get, getting realistic with these bonuses that we put in place for the last discussion that we had. And it was fairly easy to get past 50 with something that was very reasonable and in good open space and a good layout. It just very, very basic development, going from, you know, maybe something where a developer would put in 6 homes or 12 homes in that range. So my input in last meeting that we had was that, and we should allow that flexibility to a developer, where if their creativity actually tends itself to passing the 50%, why not incentivize it and allow that to occur?
The planning commission actually really loved it. He really did his homework, and we were all really impressed with it.
I think we all would love to see that. My only concern is, is the developer going to come in and sacrifice building 60 homes and getting the profit from 60 homes to come in and just do maybe a handful of homes in an area to save the density and get the cluster? So that's my only. But really, what does it hurt to have a sliding scale?
Right.
Yes.
I can't think of any negatives to have a sliding scale.
Brad, can we go back to the slide where you had the first, where you had like 14 homes? You have one that has 14 homes on it? In the very beginning, 14?
Yeah, I think the very first.
The very first. Right, so if you look at it on this, which is what Holly was talking about, because this is more typical of what we're seeing in Troy right now, and having a sliding scale for the one on the right, it's not as many that they would, like, they get 14 here, but if you were to put more units on the one on the right, it's not going from 60 to 90%, it's going from 14 units, they'd be getting more units. I don't know if that makes sense. But it helped to look at it at this level of density.
Well, particularly if you have allowed attached units in there, you can almost double.
Yeah, imagine what's on the right having being double units, and they'd be.
And still preserving all the open space.
Yeah, that picture's actually incorrect. There'd be more units on the right-hand side of the cluster.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you have to keep that in mind. 3 and 4 in our discussion kind of go hand in hand, don't they? If you don't allow, double units, you can't probably accomplish this.
Much more difficult.
It's much more difficult to accomplish this cluster unless 3 and 4, in my opinion, seem to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem Pennington.
One thing, Brent, I think we need to do is when we put this out to other developers, we need to talk to developers that have done this cluster type development, because I don't think it's new to Troy, so anybody you talk to that develops in our area is not going to be receptive to, that they don't know anything about it, so we need to put it out to other communities that have done this.
The one that example I gave that was approved, it's under construction, it's not even completed. You're 100% correct.
And to piggyback on that, Brent, do you think that we are not seeing this is because of the cluster ordinance that we have in effect today, correct? I mean, that's what's really stopping.
Yeah, doesn't have the incentives.
There are.
Yeah, there are provisions in there that I went over that are clearly an impediment. There's no incentive, it just isn't fiscally, doesn't make any sense. With very few exceptions, there's one, and they had a lot that just happened, the configuration long and narrow just happened to work that way.
Yes.
But it just isn't, it's not working, it's not incentivizing, it's a speed bump.
Yeah, I think the only reason we have one today is because it just happened to sort of work up there. You really couldn't do anything else, so.
How big are the homes on the one that we have going? What are they, stuff?
They're your standard type size, 2,800, 3,000, 3,200, that type size.
Bungalow.
One bath, one bath.
Actually, very nice home. That would fit a grand piano.
I'm gonna see that 1,500 square foot, $500,000 one you're talking about.
Yeah.
It better be nice, eh?
Yeah.
Waiting out a breeze.
Well, I agree with you. I think there's not a market for, I don't think houses that cost that much. People that are in the market for those 1,500 square foot houses want to pay less.
So if you build it, they will come.
Hopefully.
I can speak from my personal experience. I'm not gonna downsize if it's gonna cost me more money. But, I mean, that's kind of what's prohibiting me from downsizing today, you know, the Headley, all of those issues, financial issues, and I'm not gonna, I'd like to downsize, but it would cost me more money to downsize today. So there's no incentive for me to do it. Until maybe we can encourage somebody to come into our community and make it more financially rewarding to us.
Or as I told Brian, I probably will just wait for the high rises on the Civic Center. 'Cause we'll put the grand piano on the top floor.
Don't buy green bananas, remember.
I know, I don't. That's why you gotta get going on
Mayor? Didn't we have one developer actually express interest in us revising this cluster ordinance when we talked about the tree ordinance? So we do know that there's some, from the development community, an interest in us revising this, correct?
That's correct, but that particular developer has a piece of property that would
Lend itself.
lend itself to cluster,
Well,
so. But still.
But still, the
Well, I think we're
point,
going to see more parcels like that maybe become available,
Right.
so I don't think a developer would do that unless we change the clustering ordinance for sure.
I guess my point is if we can create, the win-win-win, to use that classic term, both for those that want this product, for us as a city trying to protect the way the city looks and feels, and for the developers, isn't that what we want to do? And if we have that opportunity to do it, I just applaud Planning Commission for, and staff for working this through and just, logically, pragmatically having this discussion. And that's an amazing goal to have if we achieve that. Doesn't mean every developer's gonna jump on it, but if there's some out there that would, and we benefit from it as a city in terms of what it looks and feels like here, wow, awesome. That's a great legacy for us as two bodies to leave. I would be proud of that work, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Number 4, in my opinion, it might be the toughest one to talk about, because you are talking about some areas in Troy that are up in the northwest that are big lots that we're starting to see developers come in and buy lots, tear the house down and build huge houses. Even bigger. And I'm not sure what the residents around there might want up in their area as far as clustering goes. So.
Or might not want.
Or might not. That's what I meant. And I think the thing that we have to keep in mind is that if we do change the ordinance and allow something like this, if they meet the criteria, there's not much we can do about it.
Right.
So you have to keep that in mind when we're considering this.
I just wanted to kind of jump on that thought, because in particular, we've got the Charnwood subdivision out there, one of the older ones in Troy, with the most magnificent, big 1 and 2 acre lots. Some of those old homes in there have been built in the 50s. It would just be ripe for someone coming in, and I can just imagine the neighbors looking at a cluster development between these two huge lots. maybe politically a little wiser not to do it.
That's why we're giving the city council final approval.
But, you know, it really doesn't matter who has final approval if they've met all of the criteria.
That's right.
So once you change the ordinance to allow, it could happen.
I could make a case, though, that it might be nice to do it for a particular, I mean, I know this is a singular landowner there, but if somebody wanted to live close to the temple, and you are a senior and you wanted to be close to your house of worship, that is the only Hindu temple in the community. We have a large Indian immigrant population. Many of them are of that particular denomination. Many of the people who come to that house of worship from around the region, because it is the oldest, or one of the oldest temples in the whole state, you would be attracting people who would want that in that particular place. So if you did allow it in R1A, there may be an economic benefit for that.
Do you have an estimate of how many percent of the people might be in that category that come to the temple?
If you were to walk into the temple any particular day, I would say the exact candidates, you've got young families and older people, and that's
Okay.
the majority of the people who are walking into the temple.
They
So-
probably don't live there.
That don't live, yeah. As far as zip codes and where's membership, I don't even think half the temple membership is from Troy.
That's a good point.
Tom?
Just want to comment. What we're talking about here is allowing, we're right, this whole, all the ordinances, all of, including existing cluster housing ordinance, encompasses the entire city. It's just the duplexes that we're talking about to allow in A and B. I just want to make that clear. We're not talking about right now, the way that we're proposed is to allow duplexes in C, D, and E, but not in A and B. And the question before us, should we allow it in A and B? And my quick thought is no.
Right.
John?
Yeah, I'd be concerned with being able to integrate a product like that into these neighborhoods, certainly from a political standpoint, but also just integrating that type of a product within that existing. I think Tom made a good point. We're talking about a very specific type. We're not talking about eliminating a cluster option or an option up to, is it 1,500, whatever the square footage ends up being. So I would think if council thinks that's viable, that we really need to study that a little bit closer before we make that step.
I just wanted to piggyback on this. We actually had this discussion in our last meeting, and there's the hypothetical situation where there's a development with absolutely no attached units, but the permitted setback that is being proposed is only 7.5 feet to the property line side yards. And with the option to actually even decrease that permitted by the planning commission down to 5, down to 4 feet. And that's even without duplexes, without that attached unit. So there is that potential that the way we're discussing to move forward, that there would be a cluster development in 1A or 1B with homes that are located 5 feet from the property line.
I tend to agree with Ollie. I think it doesn't discourage a developer from going in there and developing something in a cluster option with these new side yard setbacks that we're talking about. And they're still individual homes, they're not attached. Maybe we should allow that cluster option to be used in R1A and 1B, but just not attached units. Think about that.
That's actually what is proposed now.
Brent, is that what's on the proposed now?
I just want to clarify. The cluster option is proposed for A, B, C, D, and E. The issue that we're talking about is allowing attached. Mr. Councilman Campbell used the D word that you'll notice I specifically tried not to use it. I lived in a duplex when I was like 8 years old. I will not live in a duplex again. I will live in a two-family attached house though.
Good point.
Good point. Councilman Henderson.
Yeah, there's certainly areas in R1A that, you wouldn't want to put duplexes. You know, because you might be surrounded by things that are dissimilar and, you know, you affect the property values, all that kind of thing. But there are other properties along, I know South Boulevard, there's a couple properties where houses are, you know, in the 50s and they're big lots and just underdeveloped, you never know when those are gonna come up for sale, that could, you know, be, could be afforded to be able to put those types of things in without having to affect any of the subdivisions that we're talking about. So could be some opportunity there, but
Not duplex.
I do.
Attached. You have to say attached, no duplex.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify, and Brent, correct me if I'm wrong, but these cluster options, one of the criteria is one of the borders have to be on a major thoroughfare. So it's not like in the center of a subdivision that we're going to do this.
Has to be accessible.
Is that
Yeah,
correct?
when there's a attached housing product in, as part of it, it would have to
Okay.
have access on major thoroughfare.
So it's only attached housing product.
That's, as written, yes, that's correct.
what about backyards, back lots? So let's say we found one of those locations on South Boulevard, to use that example. So they have access to South Boulevard, but right behind them, it might be a, you know, $750,000 house. Is there any provision to try to prevent that from occurring?
Well, this would treat the existing setbacks would remain the same, so I think, I don't have it memorized, 40, 45-foot setbacks. So that would be respected and maintained. So what we're really talking about with clustering is the relationship with the new buildings with each other, not the neighboring properties. That, there would still be a significant setback for that relationship. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat. So in other words, the setbacks are gonna be the determining factor rather than what abutting properties might be, how they might be developed, correct? So there would be no consideration for abutting properties and what's developed on those, or no?
The setback that would be permitted would be the same as underlying today.
Right.
Whether it's a single, you know, if it's a traditional single-family home. That wouldn't change.
Okay. All right. We'll have another conversation.
Okay.
I'll restate that question later.
I just have one point I really would like to make. When you look at this map, it's very telling. So we're telling the residents of Troy, yeah, we're going to have everything in the yellow area, but not the pink or the purple. I just kind of wonder, why is that? Are they special? Are we trying to set them across different classes of homeowners? I think that's not really equitable or fair.
Well, we're talking about attached, just allowing it in the yellow, right?
Right. That's correct.
I'll restate it now because that kind of dovetails with what I was trying to talk about. Okay, so you've got these areas where you have a $750,000 house or a series of those. And then you've got maybe a piece of property that could be made clustering. And then, so do we just simply say, okay, here's that property, but it's surrounded by all these other things? And since it meets the ordinance and setbacks and all that other stuff, we can put duplexes in or multifamily dwellings without regard for what it's surrounding.
I understand your question.
Okay.
Sorry about that. As proposed at the first cut we took, we recognize that the attached housing product, not
Very good.
duplex,
I wrote that
attached
down.
housing product is going to be a significant change for the neighbors. We recognize that. So we felt it was important to mandate that if the development does have an attached housing product in it, it would have to have the access off a major thoroughfare. So if your question, as I understood it, was what, potential impact on an existing neighborhood. If it's an interior lot or lots, to have the attached product, it wouldn't be permitted interior, it would have to be fronting a major thoroughfare.
And that's where we're seeing most of our open space today, right? Is off the main roads, 2 or 3 acres here, 5 acres there. So
That's
in the middle of a
difficult.
subdivision.
It's a difficult one to answer because are there large tracts of land that are, significant acres that have not been developed? Yeah, there are. Not that many. But what we're seeing now is assemblage. And we've got some properties that they're relatively narrow with really long, deep backyards. And developers are acquiring 2, 3, 4 of those, or only the backyards of those, and they're assembling. So, and those, a lot of them have access on only on major thoroughfares, but some of them don't. some of them are interior.
Councilman Baker?
I think the answer to his question is that it doesn't matter. You can, as long as there's a major thoroughfare, if there's $750,000 homes all around it that also have access or near to the major thoroughfare, you can still build, attached housing in the middle of those, as long as it met the major thoroughfare, correct? I mean,
Yes.
with no regard to what is existing around it.
Stated that way, yes.
I know that's a cynical view, I
Yeah,
recognize
yes,
that, but that's the.
yes. Keep in mind, though, that the number of units permitted are determined by the parallel plan, so it does boil down to how large the property is, and that determines how many units one can get. So there is that as kind of a control mechanism.
But the question before us is, do we permit the attached housing in R1A and R1B? I think not.
I think that's the consensus that I'm hearing around the table is to allow the clustering, but not attached in R1A and R1B.
Just
Councilman Baker?
quickly to Chairman Edmonds' point, then what is the reasoning for that? If someone asks, if it's not about, well, that side has, this is where, let's just say it, the rich people live in the city. What is the reasoning for that if that's where there's more land? How do we say to somebody who lives on the east side, well, we could do that over there, but you can't do that up there? I agree that that's probably the more correct thing to do, but I'm curious what our actual logic and reasoning behind that would be. Maybe this isn't the forum to discuss that, but maybe it actually is the forum to discuss.
To talk about that.
I mean, fundamentally speaking, we need to protect people's property values to the best of our ability. And I think, without question, we're saying up in that area, attached housing, it's not an area that lends itself to that. And is that fair or unfair? I don't think it's fair to say to those that worked very hard to make a living to build those homes that we could change an ordinance that might put that property value at risk. And I think my gut reaction in this dialogue right now, unless something comes forward to prove differently, I would want to protect that corner. I think attached housing does fit in the other zones nicely and complements there. And I think that's what we're talking about. How do we complement? There are different areas in Troy, and there's different looks and feels, and we have to be very conscientious about that as we change this ordinance. So that's just, I'm giving a gut level response.
I think just piggybacking on that, what you said, if we actually want to discuss the issue of property values, then we should ask what would happen if in that same neighborhood where there are 4,000 square foot homes, we allow the cluster, and suddenly we have 10 homes that are 1,500 square foot right next door. Because right now, that's not prohibited.
That's fair.
So the issue's still on the table. What about property values if we actually allow that? So the property values are still gonna start, it'll be a dynamic thing, because it's not just detached that are gonna affect that, because if you put these homes that are 1,500 next to 20 homes that are 4,000, that there is some kind of impact there that right now we can't measure.
Yeah.
Linda, did you have
Yeah,
a comment?
any developer worth of salt is gonna look at the neighborhood that he's going to be building in, and understand its character, and I would hope design, understanding what that character is. If there's going to be a cluster development next to a 750,000 foot house, one could argue it doesn't matter whether it's an attached housing product or not. It seems to me, if you're gonna have cluster development anywhere in the city, why limit the option of the attached housing product to just the east side of the city?
Councilman Anderson? Let's wrap this up in about 5 minutes.
There are sections in R1A and R1B that
are older, and you might get, 2,000 square foot houses anyway. And you'll get, 200,000 to 300,000 price ranges. And there are big lots over there. And I don't see where it would be a problem in certain areas to, if you were bounded by those types of things to develop similar types of things. And that's where this clustering option seems to fit. Certainly some of the, we get a $750,000 house that's 4,000 square foot. If you want to put it right next to that, I don't think that would fit. But R1A and R1B has property and has area that these things could fit in.
The property is aging too.
Right. So I don't see where we should eliminate at least looking at it, but I think it should be a one-off decision, does it fit, does it not fit?
Isn't this possibly where the language that's drafted into the ordinance would give us the discretion to determine whether or not the cluster zoning is appropriate for where those parcels are located and it's being proposed? Because like Dave said, if it's in an area where there's a 2,000 square foot home would be appropriate and would be more modestly priced, even though it might be surrounded by the bigger, couldn't we just have the discretion as opposed to a blanket decision that no, we're not gonna have it there at all? Couldn't we have the flexibility?
We might maybe have to defer to the city attorney, but my understanding is if we open this up to R1A and B, and they fit the ordinance and standards, that we don't have much discretion.
So you can't argue that it, doesn't have compatibility? It doesn't conform, because I thought that was an objection that could be raised.
City Attorney Bloom?
Yeah, Mayor, there could be language that would limit the areas that you could locate within an R1A or an R1B. I mean, you would have to carefully craft that language, but it is possible. The concern, though, is that you apply it equally to everyone and that you have articulated standards and you form that basis for, limiting where you're going to place them.
It's a touchy, if I could, just a touchy subject, because we are seeing in today's world, developers come into the older subdivisions that had big lots, buying those lots, tearing those houses down and building monster houses in that lot, that I think if you live close to them, you would say that I object to that, so there's going to be people that object to putting big homes in there, and then you're going to have some people probably object also to potential clustering. These are subdivisions that are starting to turn over, and they're turning over with big houses. To me, this would be another option to a developer, instead of putting a monster house next door to somebody else that may not want it. They may prefer a cluster as opposed to this monster house too. So let's just try to do two more questions. John?
I want to piggyback on what you just said. What I think the filter we're using right now is the big house is the attractive house to everybody, and that's changing. It's not, and so that is going to drive the value of the clustered options, or even the duplex.
Did you just say that?
I started. So I think, as those become more popular and more desired, their value is going to, and I think the studies are showing that there's going to be a lot of large homes sitting vacant on the market because people aren't going to buy them. So I think there's that dynamic that needs to be thought of in the discussion.
I've been told that too, that in the years to come, these big houses are not going to be attractive to home buyers. So.
They'll be tearing those down to build
I
cluster
don't
homes.
think so.
I have one comment. I agree with what John just said, and one thing that I'm here, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but are we potentially talking about having two different cluster options? One for R1A and R1B and one for the rest of Troy?
Yes.
Because that doesn't sit well with me at some level.
Yeah.
And so I think a cluster option is important, and I think if we craft one, it should make sense for the whole city. I think John raises a good point about value and future value and direction, and you raise a point about getting input from the development community. Maybe that type of input helps us craft the cluster option that works for everyone.
I agree, and I think, you know, it's a tough decision when you're talking about changing, but I think we all agree that cluster, the way our ordinance is today, it's bad. You know, it's not being used as an incentive, so I personally would like to see if there's some language that has to be crafted, that it is crafted in a way that does give us some leeway.
In all the zones, not just.
In all the zones.
Yeah, right, I agree.
All
For
the
context, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can't.
Consistently.
You can't talk about protecting home values in R1A and R1B and then, you know, let everybody else, you know, hang. So, yeah, I agree with that.
I think,
Okay, one more, Tom.
Showing that the east side is more dense because it's zoned that way. Actually, putting in cluster housing with the option of attached housing would actually open up space. That area is very dense right now. What this cluster housing with the attached housing will allow is more green space. So by putting in a development like that, and again, those can only be off major mile roads. So again, what we're doing is taking a very highly dense zoning area and actually putting in more green space. So that's what they lack. The west side doesn't lack that. So we're just kind of balancing the green.
Different needs.
City Manager Kishnick, do you think you got a good handle on some direction here?
I think the song was 2 out of 3 bad. And so certainly 3 out of 4 isn't. And I think number 4, there's been significant discussion. We've been talking a little bit back and forth, and then Lori and Alan, to put something together, to go to the planning commission. And, you know, I think Brent started this by saying, we're still pretty much at the ground floor. This last one obviously is very delicate and very important. So we'll work on this, Mayor, and Brent will bring something to the planning commission.
just one, I think somewhere when we all started talking about this cluster option, we always refer to it as the enhanced cluster option. For those developers who are already familiar with the existing cluster option, I think we have to name this something that distinguishes it from the previous. So I think the enhanced is really something that has to go with it. That's it.
I agree. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak this evening on this item? Mr. Werpatinsky, please use the microphone. If you could give us your name too. We all know you, but.
Yeah, Jim Werpatinsky, Warren resident. I just want to say I'm really pleased with this cluster thing. I watched part of the planning commission meeting the other night, by the way, and I got a little alarmed temporarily when one of the people were talking about their wife's grand piano, and the lady talking about not wanting to get rid of all her stuff. But by and large, it was good, just as this meeting was. So I'm pleased with this. I think the big challenge is going to be getting the developers on board, because I have not been pleased with the developers working in this city. It seems like they're not interested in win-win, they're interested in they win, and the heck with the rest of you. So that's going to be the challenge, but thank you, you're doing great.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to speak on this item this evening? Well, I think it was a good discussion. I thought number 4 would probably take up most of our time, but I only offer, Brian, if Planning Commission wants to meet with us again and discuss this number 4 further or whatever, we'd be happy to sit down and, I think, and do this again, just to talk about 4. So.
And in the meantime, the planning staff are going to be writing up all the standards to meet all these various criteria. So that's a big job, too.
Big job. Okay, thank you all for coming this evening. Good to see you again. We are adjourned.
Good to see you.